all that celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message: service.
2 minutes ago, a proposed change to one of the monarchy's most guarded systems was abruptly thrown into crisis. Prince William had read the final page, closed the file, and delivered an objection no one in the room expected. The future king was refusing to approve broader access to sealed royal archives, and the records he wanted protected reached into the most painful chapters of his family's past. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William remained seated at the end of the table, rereading the clause that had stopped him cold. The Royal Archives Access Protocol, the internal framework controlling who may examine restricted letters, diaries, medical references, legal papers, security memoranda, and private communications preserved at Windsor, had been presented as a modernization plan. Officials said it would simplify research access and prepare selected documents for future digital review. But the proposal went further. It widened access to sealed files, shortened confidentiality periods, and gave a new review panel greater power to recommend the release of private family records. His formal objection halted the process minutes before approval. Catherine watched him place the pen down instead of signing. She knew the gesture. It was not hesitation. It was controlled anger. William had reached the clause covering correspondence involving both deceased and living royals, and he understood the danger immediately. Papers linked to Princess Diana, Queen Elizabeth II, Catherine, and the royal children could one day be judged by officials who had never lived through the grief, fear, or consequences hidden inside them. The princess saw his expression harden, because this was no longer administrative policy. It was a threat to private memory. The final annex made the danger worse. One line referred to records concerning succession preparation and the welfare of future heirs. Succession preparation meant the private planning used to ready those expected to inherit the throne. The wording was broad enough to include confidential discussions involving George, Charlotte, and Louis. William realized that childhood welfare, family fears, and future responsibilities could eventually become material for review. Charles received the objection inside a red folder. The king read it in silence, then asked why the most controversial clause had appeared only days before the meeting. His question changed the atmosphere. Someone had tried to move the revision forward without full royal scrutiny. William requested the names of everyone who had drafted the clause. Officials stopped gathering their papers. His refusal had become an investigation. But before William could discover who had pushed the clause forward, he had to confront the people whose memories, reputations, and deepest wounds were now trapped inside those sealed rooms. To the officials debating access periods and review procedures, the archives were shelves, codes, and catalogued history. To William, they contained his mother's handwriting, his grandmother's final private judgments, his father's most difficult decisions, and conversations his own children might one day be forced to explain. Every proposed release date represented a human being, and every sealed envelope carried a wound that had never truly disappeared. William stood between two duties that could not easily be reconciled. As heir, he understood that the monarchy had an obligation to preserve history and allow future generations to study it honestly. As a son, he remembered how leaked conversations, private letters, and selective documents had shaped public judgment of his parents. The royal archives, meaning the protected collection of official and personal records held for the monarchy, preserved truth, but truth without context could become another weapon. Charles carried the same fear more quietly. In a private sitting room, the king removed his glasses after reading his son's objection and paused over a reference to personal correspondence from the 1990s. He folded the document closed. Those files recorded a period when he had not been merely a future sovereign, but a husband, father, and grieving son, trapped beneath relentless scrutiny. Future historians might examine decisions he still struggled to discuss with William and Harry. Catherine found William standing alone, beside a desk after the meeting. He told her the proposal did not concern only Diana or Charles. It could establish the rules governing records about George, Charlotte, and Louis. She answered that history deserved truth, but children deserved the right to grow before strangers defined them. Her words strengthened his resolve, because the dispute had now reached beyond the past and into their family's future. Anne reacted with sharper suspicion. After receiving the summary, she circled the phrase, "expanded discretionary access." Discretionary access meant permission granted through individual judgment, rather than fixed rules. She warned that without strict limits, influence could decide which files remained protected and which were exposed. Dr. Eleanor Marsh, the fictional keeper of the Royal Archives, then admitted during a recorded internal briefing that several restricted collections had already been prepared for reassessment. She refused to identify them in writing, but her hesitation told William the reform might have been built around specific documents. Anne soon requested a private conversation and carried one handwritten catalog number with her. It belonged to a file created after a royal ceremony that had altered the family's atmosphere. The objection had exposed what each person feared losing, but the true cause of the crisis lay in one earlier moment, when a sealed file was opened for the wrong audience. The proposal had not begun with a public demand for transparency or a historian's request. It began 3 months earlier, inside a restricted reading room at Windsor, during what was supposed to be a harmless demonstration of the archive's new digital system. One file appeared on the screen for less than a minute, yet the words visible in that brief moment were powerful enough to alter relationships, accelerate the protocol, and alarm the future king. Dr. Eleanor Marsh had warned everyone before the Windsor Digital Access preview began. The Secure Digitization Program, a protected system designed to preserve fragile papers and improve internal cataloging, was still being tested, and confidential collections required additional authorization. A small group of archivists, legal advisors, and senior household officials had gathered to examine how restricted material would be indexed. Yet during the demonstration, the system briefly displayed metadata from sealed records: dates, names, confidentiality periods, and catalog descriptions never intended to appear together. Then the wrong file opened. Catalog reference RA/1997, PLAV-12, contained correspondence written after Princess Diana's death, concerning William, Harry, press strategy, and the future handling of their mother's personal papers. One official read part of the description aloud before the screen was closed. The words lasted seconds. Their consequences did not. Anne revealed the incident to William during a private conversation after receiving the handwritten reference. He gripped the back of a chair and demanded to know exactly who had heard it. His anger was not directed at the archive for preserving the file. It came from the casual way strangers had spoken about the worst days of his childhood, as though they were merely entries in a database. The prince understood that once grief became administrative material, people could forget the children trapped inside it. Charles suffered a different blow. He discovered that the collection included handwritten comments he had made in the days after Diana's death. Alone in his study, the king stared at the catalog number, then placed the page face down. Those notes belonged to hours of fear, guilt, and confusion. Without context, future readers might reduce a grieving father's private struggle to evidence in a public argument. The failure should have produced stronger safeguards. Instead, an internal working group used it to argue that the old classification system was inconsistent. Someone proposed shorter restrictions and broader review powers, turning a security breach into justification for greater access. William finally understood. The protocol had been reshaped around the very file that should have demanded more caution. He decided to confront its chief sponsor before Charles could be pressured into approval. The file from 1997 had revealed why William was fighting, but the next meeting would reveal whether anyone inside the palace was prepared to stand against him. The confrontation took place without cameras. announcements, or ceremonial language. William entered the room carrying the revised protocol under one arm and the 1997 catalog reference in his hand. Across the table sat the officials, who had described the proposal as routine reform. Within minutes, the future king made clear that he saw it differently. To him, they were not requesting administrative approval. They were asking him to surrender his family. William faced Dr. Eleanor Marsh, the Lord Chamberlain, two legal advisors, and Sir Adrian Vale, the official who chaired the Access Reform Group. The Lord Chamberlain was the senior royal officer responsible for coordinating major household business, while the Reform Group had been created to review how restricted records might eventually be opened. Charles had allowed the meeting to begin without him, forcing his son to argue from principle rather than borrow the king's authority. Sir Adrian defended the proposal calmly. He said the monarchy could not ask for public trust while sealing important history forever. The new panel, he insisted, would not automatically release documents. It would only judge whether restrictions remained justified. William opened the protocol, turned to the clause covering welfare and succession records, and asked whether he would allow strangers to examine private accounts of his own children's fears, illnesses, or family conversations. Sir Adrian answered that royal records belonged partly to history. William pushed back his chair. History, he said, did not own a child. The room tightened around those words. The prince accused the group of hiding a moral choice inside procedural language. His voice remained controlled, but Catherine's warning stayed with him. Once private material entered formal review, the family lost control over how fragments would be interpreted. A single sentence could be separated from grief, age, fear, or context, and presented as truth. Dr. Marsh then broke ranks. In a recorded account of the meeting, she stated that archivists could preserve documents without supporting their early disclosure. Sir Adrian turned toward her sharply. She closed her notebook with trembling hands, aware that she had challenged the person directing the process. William produced the original legal draft. The broad clause had been inserted only after the Windsor preview, without consultation with Anne, the king, or himself. Sir Adrian called it consistency, but could not explain the secrecy. Then Charles entered carrying an older directive signed by Queen Elizabeth II. William had made the conflict personal, yet the power to stop the protocol still belonged to Charles, and the document in the king's hand carried an authority no one in the room could ignore. Charles did not raise his voice when he entered the room. He simply placed a cream-colored directive beside the proposed protocol and asked everyone to sit. The document had been signed by Queen Elizabeth II during the final years of her reign. It addressed the protection of private family correspondence, but its deeper message was unmistakable. Royal history must be preserved faithfully, yet preservation must never become permission to wound the living. Charles alone could decide what happened next. Advisors could recommend change, William could object, and archivists could warn of danger, but only the sovereign possessed the authority to approve, reject, or return the protocol for revision. The sovereign, in plain terms, was the reigning monarch responsible for the institution's final decisions. That authority gave the king power, but it also left him isolated. Every choice would be remembered as his. The late Queen's directive required additional consent before anyone reviewed records involving minors, medical matters, private bereavement, or confidential guidance between monarch and heir. It did not seal those papers forever. Instead, it created a presumption of protection, meaning such material would remain closed unless a powerful reason justified access. Charles read one paragraph aloud, then stopped at a handwritten note from his mother. Future generations, she had written, should not inherit pain simply because earlier generations preserved it. His composure tightened. For several seconds, he could not continue. William understood the silence, but the king still challenged him. Charles warned that rejecting reform entirely could make the monarchy look defensive, secretive, and afraid of its own history. Protecting the family, he said, could not mean preventing difficult decisions from ever being examined. William answered without hesitation. He was not asking for permanent silence. He wanted clear boundaries, direct family consultation, and protection for people still living with the consequences. Charles looked at his son differently, then not as the future king standing against advisors, but as the grieving boy he had once tried to comfort after unbearable loss. Anne broke the tension by pointing out that the directive had been omitted from the reform group's background papers. Sir Adrian Vale replied that it had been treated as outdated guidance rather than binding policy. The king's expression changed immediately. No official had possessed the authority to quietly downgrade his mother's written instruction. Charles suspended the proposal and ordered an investigation into its exclusion. Planned research access was cancelled, loyalties fractured, and officials began blaming one another. Charles had prevented the protocol from advancing, but the moment he froze the reform, the hidden conflict escaped the room and began reshaping loyalties throughout the household. By the following morning, the suspension had touched every corridor connected to the archives. Appointments were cancelled. Researchers were informed that scheduled access could no longer proceed. Officials who had supported reform blamed William for creating a constitutional spectacle, while others quietly praised him for stopping a dangerous precedent. The palace had avoided one decision, but in doing so it had created a far more personal crisis, one that now divided servants, advisors, and family. The consequences arrived quickly. The review panel was suspended, digitization permissions were frozen, and legal teams were ordered to reassess every confidentiality period affected by the proposal. A confidentiality period meant the fixed length of time a sensitive record had to remain closed before access could even be considered. External researchers received carefully worded notices explaining that approved visits had been postponed. No reason was given, but inside the household, everyone understood that William's objection had brought the entire system to a halt. Sir Adrian Vale warned colleagues that the prince had created an informal veto for living royals over historically important records. Anne rejected that argument. She said the original reform carried the opposite danger by allowing officials to redefine privacy without meaningful consent from those whose lives filled the files. Neither side trusted the other now. Dr. Eleanor Marsh returned alone to the restricted reading room. She removed the 1997 collection from a preparation trolley, placed it inside its secure cabinet, and locked the drawer. Her hand remained on the key. Relief came first, then fear. By supporting William in a recorded meeting, she had protected the documents, but possibly endangered her position. William began doubting himself. He told Catherine that the archives might now appear damaged because of him, and that critics would describe him as a future king desperate to hide the past. She answered that refusing careless access was not the same as fearing truth, yet she could see the accusation had already reached him. Charles felt trapped by another false story. When a courtier described the dispute as a battle between father and son, the king answered sharply that William had not defied the crown. He had raised a concern the crown should have received earlier. Then an internal email changed everything. The clause covering succession and child welfare had been shared with an outside academic advisor before either Charles or William had seen it. Someone beyond the household already knew which private records were being targeted. Catherine urged her husband to stop fighting through files and speak directly with his father. The palace could survive a delayed policy, but it could not survive a permanent fracture between king and heir, and that night, Charles and William finally met without anyone standing between them. There were no secretaries in the room, no legal drafts on display, and no official record of what father and son said first. Charles stood beside the fireplace, while William remained near the closed door, both men carrying memories the archives could preserve but never fully explain. For the first time since the objection, they were not sovereign and heir debating policy. They were two people deciding whether history would separate them again. Charles had dismissed every aide because he wanted an answer without palace language hiding it. Did William oppose future access itself, or only the powers created by this proposal? The sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch with final authority over the institution, listened as his son said he supported responsible historical examination, even of painful periods. His objection concerned premature review, vague control, and missing safeguards for living people, especially children who could not consent to becoming part of a national argument. William spoke carefully, but the old wound remained close. Charles admitted that he had once believed preserving every paper would allow history to judge him fairly. Now he understood that isolated documents could harden an incomplete version of a person. The prince answered that this was exactly what had happened to Diana, whose life had repeatedly been reduced to selected moments, while the pain around them was ignored. The king lowered his eyes, because neither man needed to explain what that had cost. Silence filled the room, not as retreat, but as recognition that both were finally speaking from the same place of fear, grief, and responsibility. Charles then apologized for allowing the proposal to reach its final stage without consulting his son. William acknowledged that his anger during the confrontation had made compromise harder. Neither withdrew his position. Instead, both surrendered the instinct to treat the other as the enemy. The king placed Queen Elizabeth II's directive between them. He said his mother had protected the crown by understanding when silence served dignity rather than concealment. William touched the document and replied that their task was not to copy her answer, but preserve the principle behind it. Together they agreed on a replacement framework. No automatic shortening of restrictions. Mandatory consultation for records involving living royals or minors. Independent historical representation. Written reasons for each decision. And final sovereign oversight under clear published principles. Charles promised to announce the new approach himself. Then the suspended protocol leaked to the press before the palace could explain anything. Father and son had finally found common ground in private, but their agreement would now be tested in the one arena. Neither archives nor palace walls could control the judgment of the outside world. By sunrise, the private dispute had become a national argument. One newspaper reduced William's objection to a single accusation. The future king was trying to lock history away. Another portrayed him as the only royal willing to stop intimate family records from becoming public property. Outside Windsor Castle, cameras gathered beneath the stone walls, holding the very documents, now dividing opinion across Britain. The leak created two competing stories. Critics described William's intervention as another attempt to protect royal secrecy, while supporters argued that reform without firm safeguards would turn grief, childhood, illness, and private conflict into material for public consumption. The palace initially confirmed only that the proposed protocol remained under revision. That restraint followed royal tradition, but silence now fed suspicion. Charles and his son had to decide whether saying nothing would protect the institution or allow strangers to define their motives first. One front page captured the tension. At a newspaper stand near Victoria Station, commuters stopped beneath the headline, "Heir Shuts the Vault," printed above a photograph of William, beside a smaller image of Windsor's round tower. Some readers shook their heads at what they saw as royal control. Others argued openly that family letters should never become entertainment. The royal archives, meaning the protected collection of official and private monarchy records, had become a symbol in a wider struggle between historical truth and human dignity. William saw the front page on a tablet before a public engagement. His jaw tightened at the suggestion that he feared history, but he rejected an aide's advice to cancel. Catherine told him that calm presence would say more than retreat behind palace gates. He listened because she understood the danger. Absence would look like shame, while composure could show conviction. Charles faced a different attack. When a broadcaster called the dispute evidence of a fracture between king and heir, the monarch immediately ordered his communications team to state that the revised position had been reached jointly. He would not allow William to be portrayed as acting against him. The palace then released the replacement principles. Records involving minors, bereavement, medical matters, and living individuals received special protection. The disputed succession clause disappeared completely. Public anger began to ease, but accountability remained unresolved. Charles still had to decide whether Sir Adrian Vale could retain authority after omitting the late Queen's directive and advancing the wording without full consultation. The world had heard why the protocol was stopped, yet the monarchy's true verdict would be measured by what Charles did next, and whether William's objection produced accountability rather than another carefully managed silence. The final decision arrived without spectacle, but its meaning reached far beyond the archive doors. Charles approved a new access framework, removed the disputed clauses, and ordered that the late Queen's protections be formally integrated into permanent policy. William had not sealed history away. He had forced the monarchy to decide what kind of history it wished to preserve, one built on truth, or one built on exposure without mercy. Charles formally rejected the original proposal. The shortened confidentiality periods were abandoned. The broad discretionary panel was dissolved, and every future access decision would follow published safeguards rather than private administrative judgment. A new Royal Archives Ethics Council was created, bringing together archivists, legal experts, historians, and an independent privacy representative. The council, meaning a specialist body created to review difficult archive cases, could recommend access, but it could not override protections involving minors, medical information, bereavement, or living individuals without direct approval from the sovereign. The king then called Sir Adrian Vale into his study. Charles placed the omitted directive on the desk and told him he would no longer chair archive reform. He did not accuse the official of malice, but he made the failure unmistakable. Excluding relevant royal instruction had destroyed the confidence required for the role. Sir Adrian accepted the decision in silence, understanding that authority without trust could not survive. William returned to the restricted reading room with Dr. Eleanor Marsh. The prince did not ask to open the 1997 file. Instead, he watched her secure it under the revised classification and told her it should remain intact until it could be examined responsibly, with context, and without harming those still living. Dr. Marsh locked the cabinet and answered that preservation had finally been separated from premature exposure. Charles signed the new framework using the same pen once prepared for the rejected protocol. Afterward, the monarch handed his mother's directive to the archivist for permanent preservation. The gesture ended the crisis with quiet force. Her wisdom would now guide policy rather than remain hidden inside a private folder. Father and son emerged more aligned than before. Charles defended historical accountability, while William established that transparency without compassion could become cruelty. His objection had not been rebellion or an attempt to erase the past. It was a boundary between preserving truth and exploiting vulnerability. The victory was quiet, but its protection would endure for generations. And with the new protocol signed, the doors of history remained open, but never again, at the cost of the human lives preserved behind them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.